So I'm extra excited to talk about Logstash right now because it's a great follow-up to Riemann. The two tools actually work quite well together. So if you just take everything Kyle just said and replace Riemann with the word Logstash, you'll get like a great summary of like an introduction of what I would usually say for Logstash. So, but that's not to say that you shouldn't use Riemann. Riemann is excellent. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you guys use Logstash already? Oh, perfect. This is good talk then. So first introduction for those of you who don't know me, I like to hack. This is my graph from GitHub. You can see I'm pretty much writing code almost every day of the year. I'm responsible for Logstash, FPM, some other smaller tools, XGTool, Fax, Grok. I do sysadvent every year in December, which is basically like the Perl admin calendar, but for sysadmins, you get one cool article every day for the first 24 days of December. It's awesome. And I do hangops with Brighton and Burton. That's every Friday except for this Friday because we're here. But the first thing I want to talk about before I talk about logs and operations and things like that is like this is my most fundamental principle in interacting with communities is that if a new person, whether it's a new employee or a new person in the community for your open source project, if they're having a bad time, it is a bug. End of story, right? How many people have gone into IRC channels and asked like, I'm having such and such problem, and someone rains shit on you, right? Right? Like I'm copying and pasting this example from the documentation and it doesn't work. It says syntax error at something I can't understand. And people dump on you, right? They're like, oh, send patches or die, leave me alone. That's terrible. So like this is the first thing. If you get nothing else out of this talk, this is my feeling about the communities I want to interact with. So a quick agenda, tell a quick story. It's going to sound very similar to Kyle's story because the projects are very similar. Talk a little bit about scaling Logstash. So for those of you who already have it deployed, hopefully that will help you, as well as Logstash and Elasticsearch operations. Quick interjection, if you haven't used Logstash yet or you're not really sure what it is, you should end up with some idea, but if not, talk to me afterwards. I'm here all day tomorrow as well. But brief story is, do you have this, right? If I see some people trying to squint and maybe read this, that you've already failed the test, right? This is just too much data for a human to really identify, right? We've seen a lot of talks earlier today about visualizations are almost a little bit, what's the word? They're a greater improved way of having people identify patterns, right? The brain is a very good pattern identification tool. Right? You're not going to glean any kind of information out of this just by staring at it. And so you try and solve the problem with something like this, right? This is a regular expression. We wrote this once and it was great, and now we're covered in birds, and one of them's pecking at my head, and what happened? This doesn't make any sense, right? His hand is bigger than his head because he types so much. And the original goal was to get something like this, right? You wanted some simple search, a nice little graph, or a dashboard, some other dashboards, maybe another graph from Graphite, right? Now, the primary difference between the first slide, which was that massive wall of text, and this is there's a spike, right? And maybe this isn't the best representation of this data, but most humans can look at this image and say like, well, there's your fire, right? There's a big spike. They may not know what the spike means, but they can point at it, and now you can start zooming in. So I work at DreamHost, and I primarily work on logging-related things, and we want customers to be happy as well as employees to be happy, but we have lots of servers trying to ruin that, as well as having lots of different products that are maybe not necessarily related. The teams don't necessarily need to talk, and we have one or two admin teams or ops teams that need to tie everything together, so we end up with thousands of log sources and billions of events per day. Does this sound familiar to you guys? You have a customer who's having a problem, but logs are necessary to diagnose the problem. But your tech support guys are on the front lines, right? They're interacting with your customers who are having the issues, but they need log access. But operations is the only team with access who would happily give it if it weren't for the InfoSec team who says, no, actually, they shouldn't be having access to the logs for such and such reason. And, well, what's the standard practice? You ignore the InfoSec girls, right? Yeah? But and then, we're having a good time. Tech support is doing good things with customers. Customers are happy. And then you get this where, it's 4:30 in the morning. Again, Kyle touched on this, right? At 2, 3, 4 in the morning when you're sleeping, what does critical even mean? And it's scared. It's not going to stop barking at you, so you got to fix it. And so that's what Logstash tries to come in and solve some of these problems. And it tries to do it by sort of giving you the fundamental tools to take logs and events from any source, do some kind of processing, and get them out of the system. It's fundamentally, it's like a pipeline. Very similar to like Unix or PowerShell. If you've ever used PowerShell, you'll see very similar things. If you haven't used PowerShell, go get a Windows box and try it. The model that PowerShell uses that's improved on the Unix model, where Unix is you're piping text between unrelated programs, PowerShell you're piping objects, which is much better. So instead of, for example, running PS and getting like the third column and then doing something with the third column, what does the third column even mean? You're just saying like, well, give me the process name and the user that runs it. That's really nice. Suddenly all of your cool one-liner skills for curl and awk, you don't even need them anymore, which is awesome. Where was I? Logstash. So Logstash is a pipeline engine, pipeline processing system, and it has three main kinds of plugins or processing tools. One is inputs. Inputs are where events come from. They could be files. It could be SNMP traps. It could be email. It could be anything where you can conceivably have them being emitted from another system. And then filters are tools for processing. If you look at Apache logs, that's kind of a bullshit format. If you've looked at MySQL logs, MySQL has five kinds of log formats, right? So, Shiri's in here. She's a MySQL DB. Yeah, 5 log formats. Yeah, right? As an aside, MySQL is written in C and C++. If you look at MySQL logs, sometimes they omit the timestamp because they keep track of the last time they logged, and they're like, oh, is the time changed? No, omit the log. That's 20 lines of C. Like, you're making logging much, much harder. Like, and if you only have that one line, there's spaces where the timestamp should be. Like, thanks. So there's a lot of filters that Logstash comes with to help you sort of solve these kinds of problems. And outputs are where things go when they leave the system. They're like email or Remon or to Nagios or PagerDuty or Graphite or Ganglia. So you might have a system that looks like this, where you have some inputs, which are log files, some filters. Grok is a special kind of filter to, it's like a weapon of last resort. Like you have the worst possible log format. Grok is there to help you kind of restructure it and get it in a way that you can then maybe send it to Remon or a database system or a Graphite. And there's other filters to help you like increase the quality of the data in your events. You have an HTTP request that has an IP in it, right? Maybe you want to attach to that event where in the world that is, right? There's a GeoIP filter for that. And there's other things for like, dates are, I've been ranting about dates for years. I don't know, it might not even be worth ranting about, but there are just so many different date formats. The problem with them is that if you have any hope of correlating across 2 different applications, you've already failed because they're going to use 2 different timestamp formats, right? And that's where your awk and your Perl and your one-liner skills are going to all come together to parse these weird formats. And then the next day, you're adding a new application that has another special timestamp that's missing some data, maybe like the year or the time zone. I mean, And then there are also cases where you just, for regulatory reasons, or you just don't need the data. You need to anonymize or remove data, and there's filters for doing all of that. And finally, the last step is that once you have these events coming from files, getting parsed and hopefully massaged into a way that they're providing some kind of real value for you, that you can output them to Elasticsearch, which is a fantastic open source full text search engine. You can output it to Graphite to get some kind of metrics out of your events. And if maybe your monitoring system is poll-based and you want to be notified immediately as soon as some kind of major event happens, then as part of your event stream, you can emit something to PagerDuty or Nagios or Xenos or Zabbix, or there's lots of outputs. So the thing I want to talk for the majority of you who've already used Logstash, like the next half of the talk is basically directed to you about scaling out and operating it. And so you scale it out with a couple of different techniques. And if you look at the way Logstash is built, inputs, filters, and outputs. Inputs are sort of like I/O bound, they're reading from things. Filters are sort of processing, they're going to choose some CPU. Outputs are going to do some kind of I/O thing, they're going to output somewhere. Nothing really uses a lot of memory because it's just sort of transiently flowing through the system. And so transportation of events, you can use any messaging technology that you may have deployed already or not. If you haven't chosen one, I can help you pick one. Processing is you're just piping Logstash to more Logstash servers. If for some reason you're just CPU bound and you can't do any more processing, well, just like bring up another machine and send more events to that one. And with respect to scaling out your storage, because I recommend Elasticsearch you can just throw more nodes at, and poof, you get more storage for free. Not really free, I guess you had to pay for the servers, but it's not really a pain in the ass to do. So when I say transports, in Logstash, there's no intrinsic idea of a transport plugin. There just happens to be plugins that exist as both inputs and outputs. It can read or write from the same thing. So you can send Redis to Redis, or 0MQ to 0MQ, Rabbit to Rabbit, things like that. And the nice property here is that if you already have a system that's listed here, or there's more on the website, that you understand and you know how to operate, like maybe you're already great with RabbitMQ and you don't want to mess with 0MQ. Like, you don't have to. There's support existing for you already. So by way of really poor illustration, you'll have a fleet of Apache front ends, all doing logs, shipping off to a couple of Logstash servers, all shipping over through Redis, the middle red thing, that's the Redis logo. Which isn't necessarily, you wouldn't look at Redis as like a queue, right? But it's, the reason I use Redis as an example is because as far as transportation systems, it's not really a transport, it's not really a database, but as far as the transport options you have in Logstash itself, this one is the one newbies have the least problems with, right? For a long time, we had tutorials that used AMQP, and basically people would get halfway through the tutorials and get lost on some rabbit hole on AMQP. But you can use whatever you want. Some people have suggested using, what's that LinkedIn one? Kafka, right? There's no support for Kafka today, but it wouldn't be too many lines of code to support that. So if you have Kafka or something like it already deployed, Storm or any other kind of stream system, then it's very easy to integrate with Logstash. And the final step is that you have things processing, going through some kind of transportation system, eventually ending up in a system that we can do search and analytics on. So a lot of times we are using software libraries in Logstash that aren't like the best implementations, right? The AMQP one currently is a good example. It's not super fast. And it's not slow because the protocol, the servers that we're using are slow. It's slow because just like maybe there's bugs in the implementation. And you can work around that just by throwing more threads at it, which is a nice property. And the same thing goes for filters. If you are CPU bound for filters, you can just run more of them. With respect to high availability, I talk about Redis a lot as a transport. I know it doesn't look like a transport, but you can use it like a queue. You can have your inputs read from multiple Redis servers, right, on one side. On the other side, you have all of the things that are shipping events write to multiple Redis servers. And each Redis server, or RabbitMQ, or 0MQ, or anything that you happen to use for transport, they don't have to cluster in the typical clustering sense where all the neighbors have to know about each other. You just run multiple of them like you would routers. The routers don't necessarily do replication of packets between the routers before they forward them, right? So you're using the same idea here, where you're using some kind of service like Redis or RabbitMQ as a router. I want to talk a little bit about deploying Logstash. I'm a sysadmin by trade, so I really don't like software that takes a long time to like chase dependencies, and basicking if it takes you more than an hour to try and use Logstash, there's a bug, something is wrong. So talking about that, Logstash itself is written in Ruby, but the releases are Java jars, and the reason that's made possible is because of an awesome project called JRuby, which implements Ruby on the JVM. And sometimes when we get new users in the community, you get shocking statements like this, like, no, we can't use Java, Java's bloatware. I'm sure Kyle's had the same exact thing, like, no, we can't use the JVM, Java's bloated, it's slow. We can't use Java because computers, right? There's completely like nonsensical statements about why they can't use a particular thing. So, I feel like these people just like, they have like Doc Brown kicked down the door and they say, Marty, we've got to get back to 1985. And that's where I think a lot of this fear comes from. A lot of these things aren't true anymore. I think the fundamental thing is that, like, oh, I ran Logstash, or I ran some Java project like Elasticsearch, and then used all of my memory. Well, by default, it's going to use 25% of your memory. This is a dumb default, right? So just try tuning it, right? There's a flag that you can set. That's my recommendation there. With respect to Logstash being large or Java being large, if you still have that like unsettled fear that you can't get rid of, there's a huge ecosystem building around Logstash to help you transport events and process them in similar ways. So in some respects, Logstash is both a piece of code and in some senses a reference implementation, and there's lots of other tools that live around it that can run for people with different constraints. So on monitoring and debugging, with like Riemann, you can annotate any event any way you want. They're just basically just hashes or dictionaries, whatever your language calls them. And you can annotate them, and you can add, for example, if you're using config management, which you should be using, right? You can generate the config file in a way that says add, for every event that comes from Redis, annotate like what server I am on the event. So now you have this way of tracing events through the system. Grok is a fairly, it aims to be a simple tool, but a lot of people have trouble with it. So we've written this tool called Grok Debug that helps you build patterns to sort of parse out your bullshit log formats, basically. It saves you from writing regular expressions. But fundamentally, if you end up having to use Grok and you control the application, I think you've already failed a little bit. Because the point of Grok is that it takes unstructured, weird, strange log formats and makes them structured. And if you control the application, you control the code that can therefore output something that's in a structured form, and you don't even need this. So there are a few different ways I use Logstash for doing like live debugging of Logstash itself, as well as debugging like in-flight problems in production. And there's a few different outputs that you can use that you can just attach to sort of in real time and get the stream as they come along. And there's WebSockets, TCPs, and ZeroMQ. What else can I talk about? So measuring stuff, there's a metrics filter, which acts a little bit like statsd, if you know what statsd is. There's a statsd output. There's lots of other metric outputs. There's integration for Ganglia, a couple of commercial things. We had Riemann's on there. Yes, Riemann is on there. So if you were impressed by this talk and the previous talk, you should be good to go. As far as there, this is not rendering well. That's not helping. Anyway, the thing this is showing is that if you run top on a Java process and you have it show threads, top is just going to be like Java, 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 and you have no idea what thread is doing what, and tracking that down is possible. If you've done it before, it's like, I don't know, 6 steps and it's really complicated. If you've never done it before, you're just going to say screw it and stop using the project. But Linux lets you set like the thread name, and top will show you that. So that you can see here that there's like a worker, some lumberjack things, Elasticsearch, WebSocket. And because the main deployment strategy for Logstash is on the JVM, you get all these awesome tools for debugging it while something is going wrong. There's there's Visual VM, JStack, JHat. Talk a little bit about Elasticsearch, which is also a really cool Java project. One of the most frequently asked questions I get is that, someone's planning on deploying like an Elasticsearch cluster of like 20 nodes, and well, they only have one Logstash node writing to it because they only think that you can only have one thing writing to it at once. Well, no, as this clearly demonstrates poorly, you can have any number of things writing to Elasticsearch simultaneously. And as far as monitoring it, Elasticsearch, as a slight aside, is one of the most pleasing open source softwares I've ever used. The documentation is pretty good, the community is awesome, but fundamentally, as an operations person, it doesn't surprise me in poor ways. I think there's easy ways to get metrics out of it, whether it's process metrics, cluster health, or particular like data storage metrics. There's easy ways to configure it. Like if you do big data things, you tend to partition things by date, right? You'll have depending on what you call it, it might be a table or a file, or in Elasticsearch it's an index. We do indexes by day, and the reason you do that is because then you can age out things by day, and that makes it very easy. And if you're only searching a particular day, you don't have to scan the entire data set of maybe a year of data to search for 1 or 2 days. And with that respect, Elasticsearch comes with this feature called templates, where you can configure new indexes based on patterns. So instead of having to go ahead and like have a cron job, create a new table with a specific schema every single day, you can just say, well, anything that matches logstash --, apply the following functions. And I think almost done. Elasticsearch supports compression. You should turn that on as like as soon as you get the project up and running. It's basically 55% storage savings for free. The performance in performance tests, it's either as fast or faster, depending on how slow your disks are. But yeah, it should be on by default for you. For curation's deleting things older than a certain amount of time, right? Sometimes you may be required, again, for regulatory reasons or for debugging reasons, you want to keep a certain amount of data for X days, X months, X years. Eventually, you want to be able to age that stuff out easily, but there's tooling available to help you do that. One last shout out is for the Logstash book. I think James is here. He wrote that. The reviews we've gotten for the book, if you haven't started playing with Logstash, is that some of the more senior people in the community have said that, well, if this book was, I wish this book had been out a year ago, right? Back when they were starting to coming up to speed with Logstash. And in closing, there's a workshop tomorrow led by Pete, who's the co-creator of Logstash. If you're interested, you have any questions or anything like that about Logstash, feel free to email me, find us on the mailing list or IRC. We're very open to things. And tomorrow I have a bunch of to-dos for the hackathon if you're interested. So, weird. I don't know how we are in time. We'll probably have time for questions. I don't know where Jason is. He's gone. Do you have any prior experience with any of the particular transportation? So if you've had no what I would use is not necessarily what I would recommend a new person use, right? If you have no inkling for like a RabbitMQ or ZeroMQ or Stomp or IRC or anything like that for message transport, or just like use Redis. I know it doesn't sound like a queue, but it performs well enough to get you to the point where you can then find out, oh, well, Redis isn't working very well for us. Now let's investigate while it's still working. Let's investigate something that may work better for our particular situation, right?
What do you use?
What do I use? I use a tool called Lumberjack, which is it's listed on the shippers page, but it's a tool to solve shipping events from an untrusted environment in a secure way. So it's a combined log shipper and a protocol. I wish I didn't have to invent my own protocol in that case, but I wasn't able to find something for that. But if I needed to do Logstash to Logstash transport, I would probably just use Redis myself. Just because running it is like fairly bullshit free. You're not using it for long-term storage. You're using it for basically as a router. So things go in and then something comes up, picks it up. The question was how is Logstash compared to something like Splunk? I don't know personally because I've never used that product. But if you look at the best way I can answer that probably is that if you look at the landscape of log management tools, open source or commercial, they're all going to end up looking very similar and trying to solve the same problems. I think let's see, if you ask people who are ex-Splunk users and now use Logstash, they'll say, well, Splunk was a little bit better for X reasons. And I think right now maybe Logstash makes the better value play because it's free and the community is awesome, and right? And depending on how much data you need to store, Splunk might be quite a lot of money, and ditto for all the other commercial vendors. But I think my goal for the next, maybe in the next 3 or so years, I want it to be almost comedically like, oh yeah, well Splunk is that really expensive, less featured version of Logstash, right? Like that's the question I want to see at like Splunk conference. We're like, well, how does this compare to Logstash? You know, that's the kind of thing I want to be like, haha. But we'll see. I think that's a really high goal. I think we'll get there eventually, but. Oh, Mozilla. One nugget of wisdom. Okay, so what I didn't list as first principles because I was trying to make this talk short was that I have another first principle that is there's three phases of most pieces of software, at least especially for stuff that I write, and certainly I think for stuff that's in the wild is, one, you have like a janky version that works. It may not be a prototype, but everyone can look at that like this, like you made a matchstick house and like no one's gonna live in it, but you can vision what it would look like, and you can sort of like fantasize what it'd be like to like live there, use it. And that's like the first phase. And the second phase is like making it correct, making it provably useful in the real world, and solving all of those like removing the jankiness, sort of like making it maintainable. And the third phase is making it fast, right? Now that you've done the second step of making it provably correct and actually solving all the cases, then you can work on making it fast without having to worry about it not working because you have tests to prove it. So depending on which plugins that you're using, they may be in one of three phases. If you have questions, the community is the best place to ask. We are working on improving performance a lot. I think I do most of the performance testing at home on my workstation, which does 30,000 events a second per CPU, which is probably enough for a lot of people. But frankly, if you ask me, that's really slow. Like Kyle mentioned, like 1 million events per second. I'm like, yeah, that's where we should be, but we're not there yet. But you guys are not going to have that problem. You're having what, 128 nodes with how many CPUs? So like 1,000 CPUs. This will be fine. You're good. But there are good ways to performance test stuff. Like there's a generator input that will just generate events endlessly, so you can then test like, well, what is the cost of a particular filter, and if the cost of that filter is too high, well then can we start addressing where that event is coming from? Like, can we configure how that's emitted, right? For example, Apache is a great example. Apache's common log format, like you have to be an expert to read it. Like you as an expert would know where the response code is, but a normal human's just like, that's a wall of text. We have now a sample Apache config that will have it output the log in JSON format, right? Now you don't need a filter, right? Then Logstash doesn't have to spend any CPU. Nothing has to spend time doing regular expression bullshit to parse it. And you can just ship it into an engine that can receive it as is, like Elasticsearch.
What's the state of the Puppet and Chef support for Logstash?
So the question is, what is the state of Puppet and Chef support? Puppet, quite good. Chef, I don't know. I know there's a lot of active Chef users who are trying to maintain like what is the most commonly used Logstash cookbook, but I don't really know the state of it.
I can answer that if anybody wants to hunt me down later.
Find that person. I can't see, it's so dark back there.
John.
Oh, but regarding the Puppet one, the Puppet, I think the best Puppet module for Logstash is generated based on the Logstash code itself. So in the Logstash config, there's inputs, filters, and outputs, and the documentation is generated from the code as well. So all the code comments end up becoming inlined in the documentation, and that's how that's sort of like the purpose of writing comments in the plugins themselves. And in what the author of the Puppet module did is instead of, he took the documentation generator, instead of having it generate documentation, he had it generate a bunch of Puppet defines. So now you have like a Logstash input file, custom defined, that you can just define in Puppet. And you can write your Logstash config in Puppet language instead of having to learn the Logstash language, which is really cool. And I'm hoping that the Chef one will get there eventually. Yes, that is an electrical one. Any other questions? Sweet. I have lots and lots and lots of stickers. I didn't know how big the conference was, so I brought 500. So take some stickers. I'll find them in a second once I find my bag. And if you have any questions, and I'll repeat the very first slide, which was this one. Like, if you are using something and you're having a bad time, it's a bug. Come ask for help. Don't bang your head on something for 3 or 4 hours wondering how you're misreading the documentation. And I think it should go for like any project. If you have a problem with the project and you ask the people who are supposed to be the most knowledgeable and they tell you to F off, like maybe don't use that project anymore.